and welcome to Pipes and Pondering. Today we're going to have a slightly more off-the-cuff episode. This morning I was listening to one of the most recent episodes from a podcast called The Red Thread that is hosted by Charlie, Wendigo, and Jackson, and they were talking about wendigos. I should also say, if I accidentally say wendigoons instead of wendigos, it's because one of the hosts is called Wendigo, as I mentioned, and even within the Red Thread podcast, they were getting that mixed up. But as they were talking about wendigos, I think that they were making a lot of really interesting points, and the lore that they were discussing was really informative and fascinating. But I do think that there are a couple of important points behind not just wendigos, but every good folklore monster that they kind of misunderstand at their core. I will say I am really enjoying the podcast, the few episodes that I've listened to it, and I really enjoyed this episode. But what I'm talking about here is really just kind of taking out a couple of statements that they've made that don't necessarily affect the podcast as a whole or even the episode as a whole, but I think are really important points to make nonetheless. At one point towards the beginning of the episode, one of the hosts, I think it was Jackson, but I can't remember, says that the Wendigo is similar to the modern boogeyman, saying that the Wendigo was told to Native American children, oh, don't wind up eating other people or stealing things or you might turn into a Wendigo. Just like nowadays we tell our kids, well, you better eat your vegetables, otherwise the boogeyman is coming for you. And that was the example that was mentioned, that the boogeyman will come for kids who don't eat their vegetables. Now, of course, we say that the boogeyman comes for kids who don't do all sorts of things, right? Don't listen to their parents, don't eat their vegetables, don't go to bed on time. But I think that by comparing the Wendigo to a modern boogeyman, I think that that misses a vital distinction. That if the boogeyman eats kids or kidnaps kids who don't eat their vegetables, it's a really arbitrary punishment. There's nothing inherent about a boogeyman and kids not eating their vegetables, right? This is just a random punishment. The Wendigo, however, is actually a well-designed folklore monster. And the reason why is because it gives highly appropriate punishments. Now, before I go on to clarify that, let's talk about what a Wendigo is. Now, I will say that I'm not an expert when it comes to Wendigos. I've watched a handful of media pieces that deal with Wendigos, and I've obviously listened to this Red Thread podcast, but if I get any of these details wrong, my apologies. But a Wendigo is basically a famished spirit that constantly eats people. Is known for cannibalism as its primary trait. Now, its physical appearance can vary relatively wildly. In most traditional Native American folklore, from what I gather, it's usually depicted as extraordinarily skinny, very emaciated. However, in the podcast, it did mention that I think some of the traditional Native American stories also have it growing larger and larger each time it consumes a new person. Now, with modern interpretations of it, the Wendigo oftentimes has antlers, but that's definitely been a more modern addition. Now, let's move on to the applicability of the Wendigo's horror, now that we've talked about really what it is. And this is this core distinction that I don't think the Red Thread really understood. I think why the Wendigo is such a persistent and lasting horror fixture is because it is a lesson that you become what you cherish. That, according to the Red Thread in folklore, most people become Wendigos when they commit cannibalism. This is what's known by pretty much anybody who has heard about a Wendigo before and has any idea of it. But something that I didn't realize is that, according to folklore, you can also become a Wendigo if you are extraordinarily selfish, that if you wind up stealing from others, or if you cause feuds within the community, and any number of other acts. And this seems somewhat random, right? I mean, what's similar about stealing from somebody or causing a feud or causing beef with your neighbor to actually eating somebody. And while these appear random, I think that they actually have a very specific similarity to them. That the connection between all of these is that it is taking something that somebody else needs in order to sustain yourself. In some ways, this is very similar to if you've ever heard Christ saying about anyone who hates a brother or sister is a murderer. That there's the idea that if you wind up hating somebody, that is still a sin against wishing them harm, right? That's not going as far as actually killing them, but you still wish them harm. That it's the exact same moral issue, just a different severity of it. And I would argue that the same thing happens with all the examples that they brought up within the podcast, that every single instance of stealing or trying to cause strife is trying to consume something that your fellow needs in order to fulfill yourself and sustain yourself. Probably past, not always, but sometimes past what you even need. That if you wind up stealing somebody's lunch money, we'll say for a stereotypical school example, then that's in order to sustain yourself by taking from them. If you cause strife with your neighbor, that is in order to sustain some aspect of yourself, right? It could be in order to try to boost your own ego, boost your own status, right? Or it could be in order to try to tear them down, once again, try to build yourself up. And both of those are different ways of sustaining yourself, one being very physical, one being more psychological and social. And the most extreme version of that is literally consuming the other's flesh in order to sustain your own flesh. And I believe that's really what the Wendigo is about. Is that it's trying to steal whatever is needed to sustain another person, whether it is biological, whether it is spiritual, whether it is social, in order to increase yourself. And it is because of the fact that the Wendigo, I believe, is such a great image for the evils of taking from another in order to sustain yourself, that the Wendigo has really been able to be such a fixture, even though it hasn't been as used nearly as often as vampires and zombies. And in fact, towards the end of the video, Charlie wound up making a comment that he finds Wendigos more compelling than, I'm pretty sure he mentioned vampires and zombies specifically, but he gave a couple of examples that he thought that the Wendigo is a lot more compelling. And he said it was more compelling because the Wendigo actually delves into certain psychological fears and physiological needs. That, especially in much harder times with Native Americans, they needed to make sure that they had unity within the tribe, whether it be literally not eating each other when it came down to extreme conditions, or just not causing beef with each other by stealing or trying to cause chaos. And it is because, according to Charlie, that the Wendigo really tapped into these social fears, that the Wendigo is a much more compelling nemesis than a vampire or a zombie is. And I would argue against that, actually. That I think both vampires and zombies can be extraordinarily compelling monsters. Now, have they been overdone? I would say they've been overdone to death, but they're already dead. So that statement doesn't work. But they have been done too much, and they have been done very poorly for the vast majority of their incarnations or reincarnations. But that doesn't mean that they don't possess some very fundamental elements that are very telling of culture. That I think that there is some really good work to be done in film and books to really tell compelling stories about zombies and vampires, and I think that there's a lot of very compelling analysis to be made as well. I recently just read a book called Zombies in Western Culture. This is by, I'm not going to try to say those names. I will post these on the side of the video right here. But definitely not saying those. Anyways, though, this is analyzing zombies in Western culture as a 21st century crisis, arguing that zombies and the rise of zombies in media wind up telling a lot about our culture. And when it comes to vampires, I've actually been fascinated with vampires for years. My undergraduate thesis was actually examining vampires in the eschaton, and I think that they're very potent images when used correctly. Although, like I've said, they have been used incorrectly innumerable times at this point, especially since Twilight. But moving back to the Wendigo, though, I think that the Wendigo is a very compelling creature. In my opinion, not necessarily more so than zombies and vampires, but I think it winds up moving into a different social critique. So, some overlaps, of course, with zombies and vampires, but a bit of a different social critique, and one that really has not been analyzed or utilized to its fullest. That's one thing that the Red Thread talks about towards the end of their podcast, that the Wendigo has been used in a handful of media. Until Dawn, the video game, is one that I've watched, and it's used extraordinarily well. I'm a big fan of Stephen King's Pet Sematary. Apparently it's also used in, I believe, the Hannibal TV series they mentioned, and another movie. But to wrap up this video, I'd actually like to propose a couple of different ways that a Wendigo could be used in a bit of a different light to tell a new type of Wendigo story. These are obviously just possibilities, but I think that they could really breathe new life, as it were, having so many undead puns in this episode, but breathe new life into the Wendigo as a fixture of storytelling, as well as also get at some other aspects of its excessive consumption. Because from what I've seen, the only times that the Wendigo has been used as a creature that winds up eating human flesh, that cannibalism aspect. But as I mentioned earlier in the video, that's only one way that a person can turn into a Wendigo. That they can also turn into a Wendigo by sowing chaos, by stealing, and all of this is in order to fulfill their own needs. Overconsumption, harming their neighbor in order to sustain themselves. Sustain or gorge themselves, I should say. And here are a couple of possible ways that you could tell a bit more of a modern Wendigo story. First possible way that I came up is a former college quarterback who is in the middle of his life. His glory days are spent, and because of that, he is emaciated. Not in the sense that he is physically lacking. He has a solid job. Everything seems to be going well in life, but he doesn't have that glory that he had back in his golden days of his youth. And one way that he could try to regain that is by driving his son to be a football prodigy. That his son has no interest in football, has no talent whatsoever, but his father is feeling famished because he has no personal glory left. It's all in the past. But if he consumes his son's agency by taking this choice away, consumes any validation that his son is trying to get in other aspects of life, whether it be through the arts or whether it be choosing any other career path, the father could try to consume the agency of his son, his son's search for validation in order to preserve his own, to consume those things that are vital for his son's existence, in order to just try to prolong his life indefinitely. And then slowly, over the course of the story, the father slowly could physically turn into a Wendigo, or he could turn into a Wendigo during dream sequences, but there would be slight moments where you could see how he looks physically, just as his normal self, versus how he looks spiritually and ethically. Now, a second potential way to take a Wendigo storyline within the modern era is an extraordinarily wealthy businessman. We could have the stereotypical plot line about how he pays his workers very little and works them nearly to death. But I think this would work really well with the Wendigo twist, because he is consuming far beyond what he needs to, right? That he, by underpaying his workers, he is consuming his workers' wages in order to increase his own finances. And by overworking them, he's consuming their lives in order to increase the quality of his own. Then, slowly, you have these moments, once again, like with the previous example, where you see how the wealthy businessman looks physically, right? And physically, he looks the exact opposite of your classical Wendigo, right? The classical Wendigo is extraordinarily skinny, it is famished, and this businessman looks extraordinarily fat, right? But the only reason why he is fat is because his soul is so hungry. That's really the essential irony of the Wendigo, that it is the person that eats the most, and yet is the person that is the hungriest, right? Because is the one who's literally a bottomless pit. That this man, this hypothetical businessman, is willing to consume every cent he can get out of these workers by lowering their pay, by overworking them, because he's constantly just trying to feed himself. And I think that this is a really good way to start to further develop the idea of the Wendigo as someone who is a cannibal, right? But not always a cannibal of flesh. Sometimes it can be a cannibal of agency or a validation, as seen with the possibility of the former college quarterback, or in the case of the modern businessman, a cannibal of his fellow humans' wages, right? Of their lives that he winds up exhausting. I think that this would be a good way to get across that the reason why Wendigos have been so persistent is that they apply to not only Native American cultures, but they apply to ours as well. That Wendigos, as this essence of consuming thy neighbor, if you will, is not something you just find in the woods in the middle of nowhere, right? Sometimes they're found in cities, and sometimes Wendigos come in suits. That's all about whether or not you will consume your neighbor or choose to love them, which means sacrifice. But let me know what your thoughts about this. Did you enjoy the Red Thread episode? If you listened to it, I hope you did. I really enjoyed it as well. Like I said, this is not me trying to annihilate their episode or anything. These were just a couple of minor thoughts that I had as a combination of a couple of critiques, as well as a couple of ways that I kind of wanted to push this dialogue forward. If y'all have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Also, if you would like to hear me talk about zombies and vampires at some point, once again, leave that in the comments below, because I definitely enjoy talking about those at some point. But with that, hope everyone has a phenomenal day. Cheers.